I remember the day my life ended. Not the day my heart stopped beating. That would come later, much later, in the cold darkness beneath Terra's mountains. No, I mean the day I truly understood what I was, what I would become, and what fate awaited me at the very heart of humanity's Imperium. This is the story of my journey from a simple human being to fuel for the God Emperor's eternal beacon. This is what it's like to be sacrificed to the master of mankind. Before we begin this descent into the depths of the Imperial Palace, tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Are you comfortable, settled in for the night, or perhaps listening as dawn breaks? I ask because what I'm about to share with you spans weeks, months, perhaps even years, depending on how you measure time when your very soul is at stake. This is a journey that took me from my homeworld to the throne world, from innocence to understanding, from life into something else entirely. Let me start at the beginning, when I was still just another citizen of the Imperium, unaware of the curse growing inside my mind. The Awakening. I was 17 standard Terran years old when it first happened. 17 years of a normal life on a hive world whose name I can barely remember now. The memories fade, you see, consumed by what came after. I worked in the lower manufactorum levels, sorting components for weapons I would never fire, building machinery I would never understand. It was a good life by the standards of the Imperium. I had food, I had shelter, I had the Emperor's light, or so the priests told us during our weekly devotions. The first manifestation came during one of those devotions, actually. Hundreds of us packed into the chapel level, the incense thick in the recycled air, the servitor priest's mechanical voice droning the litany of protection. I felt it then, a pressure building behind my eyes, a sensation like my skull was too small to contain what was growing inside it. At first, I thought it was just the heat, the crush of bodies, the stale air. I tried to focus on the words, on the golden aquila hanging above the altar, on anything but the mounting pressure. Then I saw things, not with my eyes, I understand that now, but with something else, something deeper. I saw the woman standing next to me, but I didn't just see her body. I saw her thoughts like coloured smoke rising from her head, saw her worries about her sick child, her fear of losing her job, her hunger despite having eaten that morning. I saw the man on my other side, and his thoughts were darker. Anger at his supervisor, fantasies of violence, a creeping desperation that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. I gasped and stumbled backward, and that's when it happened. The pressure burst. A wave of something exploded outward from me. The candles throughout the chapel flared bright, then died. The woman next to me screamed and clutched her head. 3 people collapsed. The servitor priest's vox speakers shrieked with feedback, and somewhere in the distance glass shattered. Then came the silence. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me. In that moment I saw my reflection in their faces, fear, absolute primal fear, because they knew what I was before I did. They had all been taught from birth what to watch for, what signs to report to the authorities. Spontaneous combustion, objects moving without being touched, unexplained phenomena, voices in the darkness, prophetic dreams, unnatural influence over the minds of others. I was a psyker, a witch, an abomination. I ran. Not that it mattered. Where could I go in a hive city where every corridor is watched, every citizen catalogued, every deviation from the norm reported and investigated? I made it perhaps 3 levels down before the enforcers found me. They wore heavy armor and carried weapons that crackled with deadly energy. But it wasn't their guns that stopped me. It was the woman with them, wrapped in a body glove of midnight black, her face hidden behind a featureless mask. She raised one hand, and I felt my own psychic presence simply stop. It was as if my newfound ability crashed into an invisible wall and shattered. Later I would learn she was a sister of silence, a pariah, a null, someone whose very existence was anathema to psychic power. They bound me with chains covered in strange symbols that made my head ache and my stomach turn. They gagged me with a cloth soaked in something bitter, and they dragged me through the streets of my home, through corridors I had walked my entire life, past people I had known since childhood. No one met my eyes. No one spoke in my defense. One old woman spat at me as I passed. A man I had worked beside for 3 years made the sign of the Aquila and whispered prayers of protection. I was dead to them already. In their minds, I had already been consumed by the monsters of the warp, already lost to the demonic forces that lurk beyond reality. They were wrong, of course. I was still human, still me, still terrified and confused. But to them, to the Imperium, to the laws that governed every aspect of human existence across 1,000,000 worlds, I was something worse than dead. I was tainted, dangerous, a liability that had to be contained, controlled, or destroyed. They took me to a holding facility I never knew existed. It was deep in the underhive, far below the manufactorums where I had worked, in levels where the air tasted of ancient metal and mould. The facility was old, older than the current government of our world, older perhaps than the hive itself. Its walls were covered in the same symbols that adorned my chains, sigils that made my eyes hurt to look at and my mind twist away from comprehension. Later I would learn these were psychic wards, protective runes that had been carved into reality itself to contain people like me. The cell they put me in was perhaps 3 meters square. The walls wept with condensation. The only light came from a flickering luminator in the ceiling that hummed with an irregular rhythm that made it impossible to sleep. There was a metal bench, a bucket for waste, and nothing else. The chains remained on my wrists and ankles. The gag remained in my mouth. I couldn't see out of the cell, but I could hear the others. There were dozens of us, maybe hundreds. The sounds echoed through the facility, crying, screaming, praying, begging. Some banged on their cell doors until their hands bled. Some sang hymns in cracked, desperate voices. Some just sat in silence, which was somehow worse than the noise. I learned later that the facility had been collecting psychers from across the hive for decades, holding them in stasis until the black ships came. Some of the prisoners had been there for years. Some had been there for so long they had forgotten their own names. I spent 23 days in that cell. I know because I scratched marks into the wall with my fingernail, a small rebellion against the empty passage of time. 23 days of eating nutrient paste dispensed from a wall tube. 23 days of the same unchanging humming light. 23 days of listening to the other prisoners slowly lose their minds. During those days, I felt the thing inside me growing stronger. Without the gag, which they removed only for feeding, I might have been able to use it. I felt currents of energy flowing around me, invisible rivers of power that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I sensed the emotions of the other prisoners, their fear and despair crashing over me in waves that threatened to drown my own identity. Sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleeping, I thought I could hear voices calling to me from somewhere impossibly far away, promising power, promising freedom, promising everything I had lost. I never answered those voices. Some instinct, some deeply ingrained teaching from the ecclesiarchy priests warned me that answering would be worse than any fate the Imperium could devise. Those voices came from the warp, from the realm of demons and madness. Whatever the Imperium was going to do to me, whatever purpose they had for people like me, it had to be better than that. I clung to that belief through those 23 days of isolation. I clung to it even as I felt myself changing, felt the psychic energy reshaping the very essence of my being. I was no longer the person I had been. The awakening had fundamentally altered something at the core of my existence. I could feel the warp now, pressing against reality like an ocean against glass, and I knew with terrible certainty that the glass was very, very thin. On the 24th day, they came for us. The cell doors opened simultaneously with a grinding of ancient mechanisms. Enforcers in sealed armour entered, accompanied by more Sisters of Silence. Their presence was like ice water poured over an open flame, suppressing the psychic energy that had been building in the facility. The sudden absence of that pressure was almost painful, like having a limb fall asleep and then wake with pins and needles. They lined us up in corridors, chaining us together in groups of 20. I was near the middle of my group with 11 prisoners ahead of me and 8 behind. We were a sorry sight, dirty, malnourished, many injured from their struggles against confinement. Some could barely walk. One man near the front of the line gibbered constantly, his mind already broken by the isolation. A woman behind me wept silently, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her face. They marched us upward through the hive. I don't know how many levels we climbed, hundreds certainly. My legs burned with exhaustion. The chains rubbed my wrists and ankles raw. We passed through districts I had never seen before, places where the wealthy lived in relative comfort, places that might as well have been on another planet compared to the lower levels where I had spent my life. The people there watched us pass with the same mixture of fear and disgust I had seen in my own neighbours' eyes. Finally, after what felt like days of climbing, we emerged onto the surface. The surface. I had never been to the surface before. Few from the lower levels ever were. The sky above was choked with clouds of industrial runoff, a roiling mass of grey and brown lit from below by the glow of the hive cities. But there, through a gap in the pollution, I saw stars. Real stars. Not the artificial lights of the hive, but actual pinpricks of light from distances my mind couldn't comprehend. And beyond the stars, barely visible through the murk, I saw the ship. The black ship. It hung in the sky like a blade, like a shard of darkness that seemed to drink in the light around it. Even from ground level I could tell it was massive, several kilometers long at least, a cathedral of metal and void shields hanging impossibly in the air. Its surface was black, absolutely black. Not the colour of paint, but the colour of absence, of negation. Symbols crawled across its hull, the same protective wards that covered my chains and the walls of my cell, but multiplied 1,000-fold. Other columns of prisoners were arriving from different parts of the hive, hundreds of us, maybe thousands, all converging on the same location. A massive landing field had been cleared in the centre of the hive city, crushing entire hab blocks to create the necessary space. In the centre of the field sat a bulk lander, a smaller ship that would ferry us up to the black ship. It was ugly, utilitarian, a box with engines whose sole purpose was to move cargo from surface to orbit. That's what we were now. Cargo, resources to be collected and transported. They packed us into the lander with brutal efficiency. There were no seats, just a vast cargo bay lined with mag clamps to hold us in place. The chains that bound our groups together were secured to rails in the floor. When the bay was full, when every centimetre of space was occupied by human bodies, the doors sealed shut with a hiss of atmospheric pumps. The temperature immediately began to rise. The air became thick with the smell of fear and unwashed bodies. Then came the sound of the engines, a deep thrumming that I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. The floor pressed up against us as the lander fought gravity, climbing toward the sky, toward space, toward the black ship that waited in the void. I looked around at the faces of my fellow prisoners. In their eyes I saw reflections of my own fear, my own confusion, my own desperate hope that somehow this would not end in death. We were from different parts of the hive, different levels, different walks of life. But we were all the same now. We were all psychers. We were all bound for terror. We were all about to begin a journey that would end at the foot of the Golden Throne itself. As the lander shook and rattled its way toward orbit, as the last glimpse of my homeworld disappeared from the tiny viewports, I tried to remember everything I knew about psychers and their fate. The teachings of the ecclesiarchy were clear but vague. Psychers were dangerous. Psychers were necessary. Psychers served the Emperor in ways ordinary humans could not. The black ships came to collect them. The black ships took them to Terra. And then, nothing. No one ever spoke of what happened after that. No one who went with the black ships ever came back to tell the tale. I would soon learn why. The journey from lander to black ship was short but terrifying. Through the viewports I caught glimpses of the void, that endless black expanse dotted with stars that seemed so much brighter without the atmosphere to dim them, and there, growing larger with every passing second, was the black ship itself. Up close, it was even more imposing than it had appeared from the ground. Its surface was covered in Gothic architecture, spires and buttresses and flying arches that served no aerodynamic purpose, but existed solely to declare the ship's allegiance to the Imperium and the God Emperor. Gun batteries the size of hab blocks lined its flanks. Lance weaponry capable of cutting through other starships like knives through flesh protruded from its prow. This was not just a transport vessel. This was a warship designed to fight its way through any threat to deliver its precious cargo to Terra. The lander docked with a clang that rattled through the hull. More pumps hissed as the atmospheres equalized. Then the rear door opened, and we got our first look at the interior of a black ship. If the exterior was imposing, the interior was nightmarish. Everything was black. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all covered in the same lightless substance that seemed to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. The protective wards were everywhere, carved into every surface, glowing with a faint purple radiance that hurt to look at. The air smelled of ozone and incense and something else, something organic and wrong that I couldn't quite identify, and the Sisters of Silence were everywhere. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all in their midnight armour, all moving with perfect discipline and absolute silence. That was the worst part, the silence. There was no talking, no sound of breathing, no rustle of cloth or scrape of boots. They moved like shadows, like ghosts, and wherever they went, the psychic pressure that had been building inside me simply disappeared. Being near them was like being dead. like being a corpse that didn't know it had stopped living. They herded us from the lander into the ship proper, down corridors that seemed to stretch forever, past sealed doors whose purposes I couldn't begin to guess. We descended through the levels, down, always down, deeper into the ship's bowels, farther from the light and air of the upper decks. The temperature dropped. The walls began to weep with condensation. The sound of our shuffling feet and rattling chains echoed off the walls in rhythms that seemed almost deliberately unsettling. Finally, we arrived at what would be our accommodation for the journey to Terra. They called it a hold, but it was really a prison. A vast chamber several hundred meters across and perhaps 50 meters high, its walls lined with cages. Not cells with doors, cages. Wire mesh boxes barely large enough for a person to sit upright, stacked 5 high and extending in rows that disappeared into the darkness at the edges of the chamber. Each cage had a number stenciled on it in high Gothic numerals. There were thousands of them, tens of thousands, and they were almost all full. The prisoners already in the cages watched us with hollow eyes as we were processed. They unchained us from our groups and catalogued us one by one, taking genetic samples, scanning our eyes and fingerprints, recording our names and origins in data looms that chattered and clicked as they processed the information. A medici servitor examined each of us briefly, not to treat our injuries or illness, but simply to determine if we would survive the journey to Terra. 2 prisoners from our group failed that examination. I watched as they were dragged away down a side corridor. I never saw them again, but I heard the distant crack of bolt pistol fire echoing through the ship. The Imperium had no use for psychers too weak to survive the journey. When my turn came for processing, I stared into the eyes of the clerk recording my information, a tired-looking man with augmented vision and mechanical fingers that flew across his data slate with inhuman speed. I wanted to ask him questions. How long would the journey take? What would happen when we reached Terra? What was my fate? But the gag was back in my mouth, and even if it hadn't been, I doubt he would have answered. To him, I was just another entry in an endless ledger, another unit of psychic potential to be catalogued and delivered. They assigned me cage number 42,716, 4 levels up, about halfway along the chamber's length. The cage was exactly as I had feared, barely large enough to sit with my knees pulled to my chest, with no room to stand or lie down. The floor was wire mesh that dug into my legs. There was a tube for water and a tube for nutrient paste, both controlled by automated dispensers on a timer. There was a waste chute that emptied into tanks somewhere below, and that was all. I was locked inside and left there as the processing of the other prisoners from my lander continued below. Slowly, the cages around me filled. To my left, a teenage girl who couldn't have been more than 14, her eyes wide with terror that never seemed to fade. To my right, an older man with the calloused hands of a factory worker who spent his first hour in the cage praying in a whisper that gradually trailed off into silence. Above me, someone who moaned constantly, a low sound of animal distress that drilled into my brain. Below me, a woman who stared at nothing, her mind already gone to some place the rest of us couldn't follow. When the last cage was filled and the chamber sealed, a voice crackled over the ship's Vox system. It spoke in High Gothic first, then in various local dialects, ensuring everyone could understand. The message was brief. You are bound for Holy Terra, throne world of the God Emperor of mankind. You will remain in containment for the duration of the journey. Resistance will result in termination. Prayer is permitted, Communication is forbidden. The Emperor protects. Then the ship's engines engaged, and I felt the subtle shift in artificial gravity that meant we were moving. Leaving orbit, leaving my homeworld, leaving everything I had ever known behind as we began the journey across the stars toward Terra. The voyage would take months. Months locked in a cage barely large enough for my body. Months of nutrient-paced and stale water. Months of listening to the other prisoners cry, pray, scream, and slowly lose their minds. Months of feeling the thing inside me growing stronger despite, or perhaps because of, the suppression fields that permeated the ship. Months of sensing the warp pressing against the ship's hull, that ocean of madness and power that we travelled through to cross the impossible distances between stars. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you about the journey, before I describe what it's like to spend months in a cage knowing you're heading toward your death, I need to explain something important about what I was, what all of us were, and why the Imperium goes to such extreme lengths to find and transport people like us. You see, being a psyker isn't like having a skill or a talent. It's more fundamental than that, more dangerous. Every human being has a presence in the warp, a reflection of their soul in that realm of raw emotion and psychic energy. But for psykers, that connection is stronger, deeper, more tangible. We can touch the warp and make it do things. We can bend reality, manipulate energy, read thoughts, see the future, project our consciousness across vast distances. In the hands of a properly trained and protected psyker, these abilities make interstellar communication and navigation possible. They make the Imperium itself possible. But untrained, uncontrolled psykers are catastrophically dangerous. Every time we use our powers, every time we touch the warp, we create ripples in that ocean of chaos. And sometimes, things from the other side notice those ripples. Demons, entities of pure malevolence and hunger that exist in the warp and constantly seek ways to tear through into reality. An untrained psyker is like a beacon to them, a doorway they can force open, a vulnerable point where they can push through and manifest in the material universe. I had seen it happen once, years before my own awakening. A psyker in the mid-levels of our hive, a woman who had hidden her powers for decades, finally lost control. One moment she was screaming about voices in her head. The next moment she simply opened. That's the only way I can describe it. She opened like a door and things came through. Impossible things with too many limbs and geometries that hurt to perceive. They killed 83 people in the span of minutes before an Inquisitor arrived and banished them back to the warp with holy fire and ancient prayers. Then he killed the woman whose body they had used as their doorway. I was 13. I had nightmares about it for years, and now I was one of them. One of those potential doorways, one of those catastrophic failures waiting to happen. No wonder they locked us in cages lined with suppression fields and protective wards. No wonder the Sisters of Silence were everywhere, their null presence keeping our powers dampened and controlled. Every psyker on this ship was a threat not just to themselves, but to everyone around them, to the ship itself, potentially to reality itself if things went badly wrong. The months in the cage gave me a lot of time to think about these things, a lot of time to feel the warp pressing against my consciousness like water against a dam, looking for cracks, looking for ways in. A lot of time to hear those voices calling from the other side, promising power, promising freedom, promising everything and delivering only madness and damnation. Some of the prisoners answered those voices. I would hear them start to laugh in the darkness, a sound that started normal but gradually became something else, something wrong. Sometimes there would be lights in their cages, unnatural, shifting colours that shouldn't exist. Sometimes there would be smells, sulphurous and rotten, wafting through the chamber, and then the Sisters of Silence would come, moving with lethal grace through the stacked cages, and the sounds would stop. The problematic prisoner would be removed, executed, most likely their body jettisoned into space or incinerated in the ship's plasma furnaces. I learned to meditate during those months, not because anyone taught me, but because it was the only way to maintain my sanity. I would focus on my breathing, on the beating of my heart, on the small physical sensations that proved I still existed as a physical being. I would recite the prayers I had learned as a child, the catechisms of the Imperial cult, letting the familiar words act as a bulwark against the voices from beyond. I would think about my life before the awakening, cataloguing every memory I could recall, holding on to my identity with desperate tenacity. And slowly, very slowly, I began to understand my power. Not how to use it, the suppression fields made that impossible, but what it was, what it felt like, where it came from. I was a telepath primarily. I could sense the emotions and thoughts of others, could project my own thoughts if I concentrated hard enough. But there was more to it than that. I could see connections between people, invisible threads of influence and relationship that bound everyone together in webs of causality. I could sense the future sometimes, not as clear visions but as probability clouds, possibilities branching and converging based on choices not yet made. And underneath it all, I could feel the warp itself, that infinite ocean of energy that underpinned all of reality, the literal substance of souls and dreams and nightmares made manifest. The journey through darkness. Time became meaningless in the hold. The ship kept no day-night cycle that we prisoners could detect. The lights remained at the same dim level constantly. The nutrient paste and water were dispensed at irregular intervals that seemed designed to prevent us from establishing any routine. Without windows, without clocks, without any external reference, we existed in an eternal present, each moment stretching into the next without clear boundaries. I tried to count the days by tracking my sleep cycles, but I quickly lost count. The exhaustion of being unable to fully lie down, combined with the stress and fear, meant that I fell into a state of semi-consciousness more than true sleep. I would drift in and out, never fully resting, never fully awake. My dreams, when they came, were invaded by the warp. Strange visions of places I had never been, people I had never met, events that might have happened or might happen, or might never occur at all. The other prisoners became my world. The girl to my left, whose name I eventually learned was Sarah, would cry softly during what I came to think of as night times, though there was no actual night. She had been pulled from her family, parents, siblings, all screaming as the enforcers dragged her away. She had never wanted these powers. She had prayed every night to the Emperor to take them away, to make her normal again. Now she prayed for death instead. I could sense her despair like a physical weight pressing down on both of us. The man to my right, Marcus, had the opposite reaction. He raged against his confinement, shaking the bars of his cage until his hands bled, screaming curses at the guards and the ship and the Emperor himself. His anger was like fire, burning hot and bright, and I feared for him because I knew that anger would eventually attract the attention of things in the warp, things that fed on such emotions. I tried to calm him with my thoughts, projecting peace and patience despite the suppression fields, but my power was too weak, too untrained, and he was too far gone in his fury. On the 47th day, or what I thought was the 47th day, Marcus's anger finally consumed him. I heard him laughing, a sound that started normal but shifted into something wet and wrong. The temperature around his cage dropped suddenly, and frost formed on the metal bars. There was a smell like rotting meat. Then he started screaming, not in rage but in terror, screaming words in languages that shouldn't exist, his voice layered with others as if multiple beings were speaking through his mouth. The Sisters of Silence came within seconds. I watched as they opened his cage and dragged him out. His body was changing, limbs bending in wrong directions, skin rippling as if something underneath was trying to push through. They put a bolt pistol to his head and fired without hesitation. The noise of the shot echoed through the hold, and then there was silence except for Sarah's muffled sobbing. They left Marcus's body there for 3 days as a warning. It lay on the floor of the hold, covered in a blessed shroud inscribed with protective wards, a reminder to all of us of what would happen if we let the warp in. When they finally removed it, no one spoke of him again. But I could feel the fear in all the prisoners intensify, a miasma of terror that filled the hold like poisonous gas. The journey continued. Weeks became months. My body adapted to the confinement, muscles atrophying, bones aching from the constant pressure of sitting in the same position. My mind adapted too, finding ways to partition itself, to separate the sane portion from the portion that could feel the warp and the voices calling from it. I built walls in my psyche, mental fortresses constructed from prayers and willpower and the desperate need to remain human. We passed through the warp itself, of course. There was no other way to cross the vast distances between my homeworld and Terra. I could feel it when we translated, the moment when the ship left normal space and plunged into that realm of chaos and madness. The sensation was indescribable, like being turned inside out, like having your soul stretched across infinite distance and zero distance simultaneously. The suppression fields intensified until it felt like they were crushing my mind. But even they couldn't entirely block out the reality of where we were. In the warp, the walls between us became thinner. I could feel all the prisoners, thousands of minds pressed together, their fears and hopes and prayers creating a cacophony of psychic noise that threatened to overwhelm my carefully constructed mental defenses. But worse than the prisoners were the things outside the ship. I could sense them moving in the warp, entities of impossible size and malevolence, circling our ship like sharks around a wounded fish. They couldn't get in. The ship's Gellerfield held them at bay, a bubble of reality protecting us from the unreality outside. But they wanted to. How they wanted to. Sometimes they would press against the field, and in those moments I could glimpse their forms, their purposes, their hunger. They were made of emotion given form, rage and despair and hunger and lust and ambition, all twisted into beings that lived and thought and desired. They whispered promises through the barriers, power beyond measure, freedom from the chains, vengeance against those who had imprisoned us, pleasure beyond mortal comprehension. Every promise was a lie. Every lie was also a truth. The warp doesn't work like reality. Contradictions can coexist. Truth and falsehood can be the same thing. I learned to tune it out, to retreat deep inside my mental fortress and wait for the ship to translate back into normal space. Each time we emerged from the warp, I felt like I had survived something that should have killed me. Each time, I was a little bit less than I had been before, a little more hollowed out, a little further from the person I had been when this journey began. And through it all, I wondered about Terra. What kind of world could be so important that the Imperium would transport thousands of psykers from across the galaxy to reach it? What fate awaited us there? The priest had always spoken of Terra in hushed, reverent tones. Holy Terra, the throne world, the birthplace of humanity, the seat of the God Emperor's power. It was described as paradise and fortress both. A world of golden spires and eternal vigilance, where the Emperor sat upon his golden throne and guided the Imperium with his vast and terrible intelligence. But I was a psyker. I knew, in some deep instinctive way, that paradise was not what awaited me. The Emperor needed psykers, yes, but not to reward them, not to honour them. He needed them for something else, something the Imperium's propaganda carefully avoided mentioning. And with months of isolation and fear to think about it, I began to piece together what that something might be. The Astronomicon, the great beacon that allowed ships to navigate the warp across vast distances. It was psychic in nature. Every child in the Imperium learned that much. It was powered by the Emperor's will, broadcasting from Terra across 50,000 light-years of space. But a beacon needs energy. A psychic beacon needs psychic energy. And where would the Emperor get such vast amounts of psychic power? From us, from people like me. The realization hit me on what might have been the 100th day of the journey, or the 200th, or the 50th. I had long since lost count. I was drifting in that space between waking and sleeping when it all suddenly became clear. The pieces of scattered knowledge and overheard whispers and propaganda gaps all assembling into a terrible truth. We were fuel. We were batteries. We were resources to be consumed in the Emperor's service. Our psychic essence fed into the Astronomicon to keep it burning. Our lives sacrificed so that the Imperium could continue to function. Not all of us, perhaps. There must be psykers who survived, who were trained and put to other uses, who became the sanctioned psykers and astropaths who served throughout the Imperium. But many of us, perhaps most of us, were bound for the Golden Throne, to have our souls slowly burned away to power the beacon that kept humanity's empire together. I should have been horrified. Part of me was horrified. But another part, the part that had been shaped by 17 years of ecclesiarchy teaching and imperial propaganda, felt something else. Pride, purpose, meaning. If I was to die, if my brief life was to end in service to the Emperor, then at least it would matter. At least it would serve a function greater than myself. In a galaxy where so many lives were meaningless, where billions toiled and died without impact or remembrance, I would be part of something important. My death would light the way for the Imperium's ships. My sacrifice would keep humanity together across the stars. It was a strange kind of comfort, one that I knew was born partly from desperation and partly from a lifetime of indoctrination. But it helped. As the weeks continued to stretch into months, as my body grew weaker and my mind grew more fragmented, that sense of purpose became a lifeline. I was going to die for the Emperor. I was going to become part of something eternal, something that would long outlast my physical form. Sarah didn't share my revelation, or if she did, it brought her no comfort. She retreated deeper into herself as the journey progressed, speaking less, eating less, staring at nothing with eyes that seemed to see into some other place. I tried to reach her with my mind, tried to offer some fragment of hope or companionship, but she was beyond my ability to help, The woman below me never spoke at all, existing in some catatonic state that might have been mercy, or might have been the slow death of her soul. The man who had taken Marcus's place to my right prayed constantly, an endless stream of high Gothic verses and litanies that became a kind of background noise, as constant and meaningless as the hum of the ship's engines. I counted at least 50 prisoners who were removed from the hold during the journey. Some were taken because they had died, their bodies finally giving out under the stress of confinement. Others were taken because they had begun to change, to manifest the signs of demonic possession or warp corruption. A few simply vanished without explanation, here one moment and gone the next, their cages left empty as reminders of the arbitrary nature of our existence. And then, when I had given up trying to track time entirely, when I had accepted that the cage was my entire universe and would remain so until I died, something changed. I felt it before I understood it, a shift in the ship's movement, a change in the background vibration that had become so familiar I barely noticed it anymore. The ship was slowing down. We were approaching something massive, something with enough gravity to affect our trajectory. We had arrived at Terra. The hold erupted in noise as prisoners realized what was happening. Some cheered, relieved that the journey was finally ending. Some screamed, terrified of what came next. Some, like me, said nothing, simply waiting to see what fate had in store. The Vox system crackled to life, and that same emotionless voice made an announcement. Prepare for orbital insertion. The throne world welcomes you to the Emperor's service. Blessed is the mind too small for doubt. And with those words, the next phase of my journey began. The warp and the voices. During my time in the cage aboard the Black Ship, I came to understand something fundamental about what I had become. The warp, that ocean of psychic energy and chaos that underlay all of reality, was not just something I could sense. It was something that sensed me in return. And the things that lived within it, those entities of pure malevolence and hunger, were very, very interested in people like me. The voices started on the third week of the voyage, or what I estimated to be the third week. At first, they were so subtle I thought they were my own thoughts, suggestions, impulses, urges that seemed to arise naturally from my own mind. A whisper telling me I could escape if I just used my power. A feeling that the Sisters of Silence weren't as strong as they appeared. A certainty that I could break free, could save myself, could avoid the fate that awaited me on Terra. But gradually I realized these weren't my thoughts at all. The style was wrong, the reasoning alien. These were intrusions, external voices disguised as internal monologue, testing my defenses, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. I learned to recognize them by their promises. They always promised power, the ability to shatter my chains, to overcome the null presence of the Sisters of Silence, to bend reality to my will and escape to freedom. They promised knowledge, secrets of the universe, understanding of the warp's true nature, insights that would elevate me beyond mere humanity. They promised pleasure sensations beyond anything the physical world could offer, experiences that would make every moment of suffering worthwhile. And they promised vengeance. They whispered about everyone who had wronged meth people, who had feared and rejected me when my powers manifested. The enforcers who had dragged me from my home. The Imperium itself that was transporting me to my death like cargo. The voices told me I could punish them all, could make them understand what they had done to me, could extract payment for every indignity I had suffered. Every promise was a lie wrapped in a truth. Yes, Opening myself to the warp would give me power, but it would also give those voices control, would transform me into a doorway through which demons could enter reality. Yes, I could gain knowledge, but that knowledge would drive me mad, would fill my mind with truths too terrible for human sanity to process. Yes, I could experience pleasure, but it would be the pleasure of a slave addicted to their master's touch, a degradation disguised as reward, and vengeance. Vengeance would cost me my humanity, would turn me into the very monster the Imperium feared all psychers might become. I watched it happen to others. The man in the cage above mine started laughing one night, a sound that began normal but gradually shifted into something wet and wrong. His body began to change, bones cracking and reforming, skin rippling as if things were moving beneath it. The Sisters of Silence came within seconds, but it was already too late. Whatever he had been was gone, consumed by the demon that had used his weakness as a doorway into reality. They executed him and burned his body, and the smell of sanctified flames consuming corrupted flesh lingered in the hold for days afterward. After that, I became more vigilant. I learned to recognize the voices not just by their promises, but by their fundamental wrongness. They claimed to be offering help, but there was no compassion in them, no genuine concern for my well-being. They were predators, pure and simple, and I was prey they were attempting to lure into their grasp. I recited the Imperial Catechisms constantly, using the familiar words as a bulwark against the whispers. Blessed is the mind too small for doubt. An open mind is like a fortress with its gates unbarred and unguarded. The rewards of tolerance are treachery and betrayal. Hope is the first step on the road to disappointment. The words had always seemed harsh to me before, expressions of a paranoid and cruel philosophy. But now I understood their purpose. They were weapons, defenses against the seductive lies of chaos. The Ecclesiarchy's teachings about the warp made sense in a way they never had before. This wasn't superstition or primitive fear of the unknown. This was recognition of a very real, very immediate threat. The warp was full of entities that wanted nothing more than to corrupt and destroy humanity, and untrained psychers like me were their preferred targets. Every one of us was a potential doorway, a weak point in reality's fabric that could be torn open if we weren't careful. I thought about the woman whose demonic possession I had witnessed as a child. I had nightmares about her for years, the way her body had opened like a door, the things that had emerged, the screams of the people they killed. Now I understood what had really happened. She had listened to the voices. She had believed their promises. She had opened herself to the warp, and the demons had been waiting for exactly that moment of vulnerability. I would not make her mistake. Whatever fate awaited me on Terra, however I was to die in the Emperor's service, it would be as a human being. I would not give the forces of chaos the satisfaction of claiming my soul, of using my body as a doorway, of transforming me into one of their servants. If the Imperium wanted to consume my psychic essence to power the Astronomicon, at least that consumption would serve humanity. At least my death would mean something beyond just feeding the endless hunger of the warp's denizens. This resolve was tested constantly. The voices never gave up. They tried different approaches, sometimes aggressive, sometimes gentle, sometimes appearing as the voices of people I had known, claiming to be fellow prisoners reaching out for connection. They exploited every moment of weakness, every second when my mental defenses wavered. During the times we translated into the warp for faster-than-light travel, the voices became overwhelming, a cacophony of promises and threats and seductions that crashed over me like a psychic tsunami. But I endured. I held on to my humanity, my sanity, my determination to serve the Emperor rather than chaos. And slowly I began to understand why the Imperium was so ruthless with psychers. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was necessity. Every unsanctioned psyker was a catastrophic threat, a potential Armageddon waiting to happen. The sacrifices made to collect and control us. The brutal efficiency with which we were transported and processed. The willingness to kill us at the first sign of corruption, all of it made terrible, pragmatic sense. The Imperium was playing a game with stakes beyond my comprehension. One corrupted psyker could kill thousands, could summon demons that would slaughter entire populations, could trigger events that cascaded into planetary or even sector-wide disasters. Set against those potential consequences, the harsh treatment of psykers seemed almost merciful. Better to kill 10 innocent psykers than allow one corrupted one to survive and bring damnation to millions. I carried these dark thoughts with me through the final weeks of the voyage. They gave me context for what was happening, helped me understand the system I was caught within. The Imperium wasn't evil, it was desperate. Humanity was surrounded by threats on all sides. Alien invasions, traitor uprisings, and worst of all, the constant pressure of chaos seeking to corrupt and destroy from within. The harsh measures, the brutal efficiency, the casual cruelty, all of it was in service of survival. And if my death could contribute to that survival, then perhaps it was worth it. When we finally reached Terra, when the ship entered orbit around the throne world and I caught my first glimpse of that grey, polluted, overpopulated fortress of a planet, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Fear, certainly I was approaching my death, and no amount of philosophical acceptance could entirely erase that terror, but also relief. I had made it. I had endured the voices, had resisted the temptations, had remained human despite everything. Whatever happened next, I would face it as myself, not as some corrupted shell wearing my face. The Emperor protects, the saying went. And as I descended toward the surface of Terra, I finally understood what that phrase really meant. The Emperor protected humanity by consuming people like me, by using our psychic potential as fuel for the systems that kept the Imperium functioning. It was a hard truth, a dark truth, but a truth nonetheless. And I could accept it. I would accept it, because the alternative, allowing chaos to claim me, becoming a doorway for demons, betraying everything humanity stood for that was unthinkable. I would die on Terra, but I would die human, die in service to the Emperor, die knowing that my sacrifice served a purpose greater than myself. The voices from the warp would not claim me. Chaos would not win. I belonged to the Emperor now, and whatever he demanded of me, I would give willingly. Arriving at the throne world. The transition from cage to transport was almost more brutal than the months of confinement had been. They came for us in groups, unlocking entire rows of cages at once and herding us out like livestock. My legs barely functioned after so long sitting, and I collapsed immediately, catching myself on the wire mesh floor with hands that had grown thin and weak. Around me, others were in similar states. Some couldn't even stand, and were simply dragged by their chains toward the processing area. The Sisters of Silence were everywhere again, their presence dampening any hope of using our psychic abilities even if we had the strength to try. But this time there were others with them, Medici servitors that examined us with mechanical efficiency, culling those too weak or too damaged to be useful. I watched as a young man, probably no older than 20, was pulled from the line and shot. Just like that. His body was tossed down a disposal chute while we were forced to march past. A reminder that even now, even after surviving the journey, we could still be deemed unworthy. They force-fed us a liquid that tasted of metal and burned going down. Within minutes, I felt artificial energy flooding my system, my heart racing, my muscles tingling with renewed strength. It wasn't health, it was a chemical whip, forcing my body to function beyond its natural capacity. But it worked. I could stand, I could walk, I could shamble forward with the rest of the prisoners toward whatever came next. The ship's interior became a maze of corridors and checkpoints as they moved us toward the embarkation decks. Through occasional viewports, I caught glimpses of what lay outside, and the sight stopped me dead despite the chains pulling me forward. Terra, Holy Terra, the throne world of the God Emperor of mankind. I had imagined it as a paradise, a world of gold and green, of forests and oceans and gleaming cities. The propaganda images had shown towering spires reaching toward pristine skies, gardens of tranquility where the faithful could walk in contemplation, monuments to humanity's greatness rising from landscapes of breathtaking beauty. The reality was very, very different. Terra was grey and brown, and the sick yellow of industrial pollution. From orbit, I could see that the entire surface was covered, not in vegetation, but in construction. The planet was one endless city, hab blocks and manufactorums and fortifications covering every centimetre of available land. The continents themselves were barely recognisable, reshaped by millennia of construction and warfare into geometric patterns that served imperial function rather than natural geography, but dominating everything, covering what I guessed had once been the northern regions of one of the ancient continents, was a structure so massive it could be seen from space with unaided eyes. The Imperial Palace. It wasn't a palace in any conventional sense. It was a mountain range of fortifications, a continent-sized complex of walls and towers and defense systems that made the entire planet look like a fortress. At its heart, barely visible even from this perspective, was the actual palace structure, the Sanctum Imperialis, where the Emperor himself sat upon the golden throne. That's where I was going. That's where we were all going. The descent took hours. They packed us into bulk landers again, just as they had when we left our homeworlds, cramming hundreds of bodies into spaces meant for cargo. The descent through Terra's atmosphere was rough, the landers shaking and rattling as they fought through the upper reaches of polluted air. Through the viewports, I watched as we dropped lower and lower, passing through layers of clouds that range from white to grey to almost black, each layer apparently representing different types and densities of pollution. As we broke through the lowest cloud layer, I got my first real look at Terra from ground level, and it made my homeworld's hive cities look like pleasant suburbs in comparison. The urban sprawl extended in all directions, a seemingly endless expanse of cramped structures pressed together with no space between them. Billions of people lived down there, trillions perhaps, all packed into living conditions I could barely imagine. The poverty must be unthinkable, the suffering incalculable, and this was the very heart of the Imperium. If Holy Terra looked like this, what must the rest of the galaxy be like? The lander settled onto a massive landing field that could have accommodated hundreds of similar craft. Looking out through the viewports, I could see dozens of other landers arriving and departing in a constant stream of traffic. How many psychers were being processed right now? How many ships like ours were orbiting Terra at this very moment, disgorging their cargo of cursed souls? Thousands? Tens of thousands? The numbers were beyond my ability to comprehend. But they spoke to the scale of the operation, the industrial efficiency with which the Imperium processed psychers. We weren't individuals anymore. We were a resource, measured in units per day, calculated against consumption rates and demand projections. Somewhere, an administratum clerk was logging our arrival in a ledger that stretched back thousands of years and would continue for thousands more. They marched us off the lander into a processing facility that occupied several square kilometers of the landing field. The building was utilitarian to the point of brutality. Bare rockreet walls, flickering luminators, floors stained with substances I chose not to examine too closely. We were sorted into lines, hundreds of prisoners shuffling forward with the patient desperation of those who have no choice but to comply. The processing itself was thorough and invasive. They took genetic samples, drew blood, scanned our brains and bodies with machines that hummed and clicked as they analysed our psychic potential. Lex mechanics examined us, their augmented eyes glowing in the dimness as they peered into depths of our being that I didn't know existed. Some prisoners were pulled from the lines immediately and taken away. Where, I couldn't say. Perhaps they were unusually powerful. Perhaps they were unusually weak. Perhaps they showed signs of corruption that hadn't been noticed before. The Imperium's standards were exacting, and its judgments were absolute. When my turn came for examination, I stood before a tech priest whose body was more machine than flesh. Cables emerged from beneath his robes, connecting to banks of equipment that analysed every aspect of my physical and psychic condition. I felt his instruments probing my mind, testing my strength, measuring my potential. It was violating in a way that physical touch never could be, an intimate intrusion into the very essence of what I was. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the tech priest consulted his displays and made a notation in his records. He gestured with one mechanical appendage, and I was pushed toward a specific exit, one of 7 that led from the examination chamber. I never learned what the other exits represented, what categories of psyker were sorted to each destination, but I know that the exit I was directed toward led to a holding area marked with a designation in High Gothic, Tithe Primaris Astronomica, primary tithe for the Astronomicon, so my suspicions were confirmed. I was not strong enough to be trained as an astropath or a sanctioned psyker. I was not weak enough to be simply destroyed. I was in that middle range, psychically potent enough to be useful, but not valuable enough to invest the time and resources required for proper training. I was fuel, nothing more, nothing less. The holding area was another massive chamber, similar to the holds on the Black Ship, but even larger. Thousands of us were kept there, separated into groups by some criteria I couldn't determine. The conditions were marginally better than they had been on the ship. We had floor space to lie down. We were given actual food instead of just nutrient paste, and the suppression fields were slightly less oppressive. But the improvement was relative. We were still prisoners. We were still waiting for death. I spent 3 days in that holding facility. 3 days of watching new prisoners arrive constantly, an endless stream of psychically cursed souls flowing into Terra from across the Imperium. 3 days of listening to their stories, or rather, sensing their stories, because conversation was still forbidden, but mental impressions leaked through despite the suppression fields. Some came from civilized worlds like mine, places where the Imperium's structure was stable and the collection of psychers was routine. Others came from feral worlds where psychic mutation was common, where entire populations showed signs of supernatural ability. Still others came from war zones, planets torn apart by conflict where psychers arose in response to the psychic trauma of mass death and suffering. We were all the same now. Our origins didn't matter. Our lives before awakening didn't matter. We existed solely to serve one purpose, to feed the God Emperor's beacon with our very souls. On the fourth day, they came for my group. Several hundred of us were chained together, not the brutal chains of before, but lighter restraints that allowed for easier movement. They dressed us in simple grey robes marked with the symbol of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the organisation responsible for collecting and managing the Imperium's psychers. We were given water and food, and the chemicals they administered this time were different. Not stimulants, but something that made my mind feel fuzzy and distant, as if I was viewing reality through a veil. Then began the march into the palace itself, the Imperial Palace. How can I describe it? How can mere words capture the reality of a structure that covers an entire continent, that has been built and rebuilt and expanded over 10,000 years, that represents the accumulated architectural ambition of humanity's empire? I can't. All I can do is tell you what I saw, what I experienced, and hope that it conveys some fraction of the truth. We entered through a gate called the Eternity Portal, one of thousands of similar entrances that provided access to the palace complex. The gate itself was hundreds of meters high, its doors made of metal so old and holy that it gleamed with its own internal light. Statues of ancient heroes flanked the entrance. Space Marines in armour I didn't recognise, Imperial Army soldiers from the days of the Great Crusade, saints whose names had been forgotten by all but the most devoted ecclesiarchy scholars. Each statue was the size of a titan, and they regarded us with stone eyes that seemed to judge and find wanting. Beyond the gate, the palace interior was a city unto itself. Corridors wide enough to march entire armies down stretched in all directions. Chambers large enough to house cathedrals served as mere antechambers to larger spaces beyond. Everything was decorated in the Gothic style that defined imperial architecture. Flying buttresses, pointed arches, extensive use of skulls and eagles and other iconography that simultaneously inspired awe and terror. The scale of it all was designed to make human beings feel small, insignificant, reminded of their place in the vast hierarchy that stretched from the lowest menial to the God Emperor himself. We walked for hours. The path we took descended constantly, leading us deeper into the palace structure, farther below ground level. The air grew colder. The decorations became sparser, more functional. We passed through checkpoints where servitors scanned us with machines whose purpose I couldn't identify. We passed armoriums where enough weapons were stored to equip planetary invasion forces. We passed chapels where tech priests tended to machinery older than some civilizations, ancient devices whose function had been lost, but whose operation continued through ritual and faith. And everywhere, there were guards, Adeptus Arbites in their black armour, Imperial Guard regiments in dress uniform, Skitari warriors with their cybernetic enhancements and plasma weapons, Custodian Guard in golden armour, the Emperor's personal protectors, each one a work of genetic art capable of defeating entire armies single-handedly. They watched us pass with eyes that showed no emotion, no pity, no recognition of our humanity. To them, we were simply cargo being delivered to its destination. As we descended deeper, I began to feel something. Even through the suppression fields, even through the drugs that clouded my mind, I could sense a presence. It was massive beyond my ability to comprehend, a psychic weight that pressed down on all of us with the force of a collapsing star. The Emperor. We were getting closer to the Emperor. His psychic presence emanated through the palace like heat from a sun. And even in his dormant state, sustained by the Golden Throne, his power was enough to be felt by every psyker within thousands of kilometers. Some of the prisoners in my group began to weep, others to pray. Still others simply stared ahead with expressions of rapture or terror or both. We were approaching the God Emperor of mankind. We were walking toward the being who had unified Terra 10,000 years ago, who had led the Great Crusade to reunite humanity across the stars, who had fought his own son in single combat and been mortally wounded, who had sat upon the Golden Throne ever since, neither living nor dead, sustaining the Astronomicon with his vast will. The object of humanity's worship, the master of 1,000,000 worlds, the one being in the galaxy powerful enough to hold back the chaos gods themselves, and we were going to meet him. Not in any sense that mattered. We wouldn't speak to him, wouldn't receive his blessing or his wisdom, but we would be brought into his presence. We would be used by him. Our souls would be touched by his power, consumed by it, transformed by it into the psychic energy that powered the beacon that guided ships across the galaxy. It should have been an honor. The ecclesiarchy priests would have told us it was the greatest honor possible for people like us to be of direct use to the master of mankind. And part of me believed that. Part of me felt privileged, chosen, blessed to be given this purpose. But the rest of me was terrified, because I could feel what awaited us. I could sense the chamber of the Astronomicon ahead, a place where the barrier between reality and the warp was thin by design, where psychic energy flowed in torrents that would consume us like paper thrown into a furnace. I could sense the other psychers already there, thousands of them, their minds worn down to nothing by the constant strain of channeling the Emperor's will. I could sense the deaths, one after another, souls burning out like candle flames snuffed by a hurricane wind. 100 psychers died every day powering the Astronomicon. Every day. 365,000 deaths per standard Terran year. Multiply that by the 10,000 years since the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne, and the number becomes incomprehensible. Millions upon millions of souls, all consumed in service to the Imperium's navigation beacon, and I was going to join them. The categorization, they took us to an assessment chamber before we reached the final destination, a last sorting that would determine the exact nature of our service. The chamber was circular, perhaps 100 meters in diameter, its walls covered in the now familiar psychic wards and imperial iconography. At the center stood a group of figures I had not encountered before, sanctioned psychers, those who had been strong enough and stable enough to survive the soul-binding ritual that made them safe to use their powers in the Imperium service. You could tell immediately that they had been changed by the ritual. Most were blind, their eyes either sealed shut or replaced entirely by augmetics that glowed with a faint inner light. They moved with an eerie synchronization, as if connected to each other and to something greater. When they spoke, their voices had an odd harmonic quality, as if multiple beings were speaking through a single throat. These were astropaths, I realized, the psychic communicators who made faster-than-light communication possible across the vast distances of the Imperium. But they weren't here to communicate. They were here to assess, to categorize, to determine which of us would go where. They moved through our group. examining each prisoner with senses that went far beyond sight. I felt one approaching me, felt the touch of their awareness brushing against my mind like cold fingers. It was invasive but not violent, exploratory but not damaging. They were reading me, understanding me, measuring my potential against some internal scale known only to them and their masters. The astropath examining me paused, tilted their head as if listening to something I couldn't hear, then made a gesture to one of the attending scribes. The scribe made a notation in their data slate, and I was marked with a specific designation, a string of numbers and letters that apparently encoded my psychic profile, my strength, my stability, my usefulness to the Imperium. The assignment scale, I would later learn, was the system by which the Imperium classified psychers. It ranged from Omicron at the lowest, barely detectable psychic ability, to Alpha Plus at the highest, power capable of destroying planets and challenging the greatest entities of the warp. Most psychers fell somewhere in the middle ranges, Iota, Theta, Eta, Zeta. I was apparently categorized as Delta level, strong enough to be useful, not strong enough to require extensive training or special handling. Delta level psychers had a specific fate. We were strong enough to contribute meaningful psychic energy, but not strong enough to survive the soul-binding ritual that would be required to make us safe for independent operation. We were the perfect fuel for the Astronomicon. Our souls would burn bright and hot, powering the beacon for days or weeks or possibly even months before finally guttering out. We were the ideal resource, potent enough to matter, plentiful enough to be expendable. Some prisoners from our group were separated and taken away. These were the strong ones, the ones classified as gamma or beta or possibly even alpha on the scale. They would undergo soul binding, that terrible ritual where they would be brought before the Emperor himself and have their minds and souls reshaped by his psychic presence. Most would survive the process, though blinded and traumatized, forever changed by the touch of the God Emperor's consciousness. They would become astropaths, sanctioned psychers, servants of the Imperium who could use their powers in service to humanity. They were the lucky ones, if you could call any psyker lucky. Others were taken away for different reasons. These were the unstable ones, the ones whose minds showed signs of warp corruption, or whose psychic signatures suggested they would be vulnerable to demonic possession. Their fate was simpler and quicker: execution. The Imperium had no room for psychers who posed more danger than they provided utility. Better to end their lives cleanly than risk the catastrophe of demonic manifestation. But most of us, the vast majority, remained in the main group. We were the fuel, we were the sacrifice. We were the daily tithe of souls that kept the Astronomicon burning and the Imperium functioning. They gave us one final preparation before we were taken to the chamber of the Astronomicon. It was called the Sanctification, and it was the Imperium's attempt to ready our minds and souls for what was about to happen to us. Priests of the ecclesiarchy came, hundreds of them, moving through our ranks with blessed oils and holy water and endless prayers. They anointed our foreheads with the sign of the Aquila. They blessed us in the Emperor's name. They spoke of the honor we were about to receive, the glory of our sacrifice, the eternal gratitude of humanity for our service. Some prisoners found comfort in this. Their faces showed peace, acceptance, even joy at the thought of dying in such a holy manner. Others remained terrified, their faith not strong enough to overcome their very human fear of death. And some, like me, felt a complex mixture of emotions that defied easy categorization: pride and terror, acceptance and resistance, faith and doubt all tangled together into a knot that couldn't be unravelled. A particularly old priest, his face lined with age and his eyes clouded with cataracts, stopped before me during the sanctification. He placed his withered hand on my head and spoke in a voice rough with decades of prayer and preaching. "Child of the Emperor, you go now to the greatest service possible for one of your kind. You will become part of the light that guides humanity through darkness. Your soul will join with 10,000 others to create the beacon that makes our Imperium possible. This is not death. This is transformation. This is not ending. This is becoming part of something eternal. The Emperor protects, and in his service, you will protect all of humanity. Be at peace." His words were meant to comfort, and perhaps they did, a little. But they also confirmed what I had suspected. This was the end. There was no coming back from the chamber of the Astronomicon. There was no reprieve, no possibility of survival. I was going to die. The only question was how long it would take. After the sanctification, they led us to what they called the preparation chambers, a series of rooms where we would spend our final days before being called to service. These chambers were surprisingly comfortable compared to everything that had come before. We each had an actual bed, soft by the standards I had become accustomed to. We were given decent food, not luxury, but recognizable meals that tasted of real ingredients. We were allowed to bathe, to clean ourselves properly for the first time in months. It was, I realized, the condemned prisoner's last meal writ large. The Imperium was giving us these small comforts not out of kindness, but because it was traditional, because even the most utilitarian machine empire recognized that the humans going to their deaths should be given some final dignity. It was a gesture that cost the Imperium almost nothing, but perhaps made the prisoners more compliant, more willing, less likely to resist in their final moments. I shared a chamber with 11 other psychers, all of us classified at similar power levels, all of us bound for the same fate. We were finally allowed to speak, and for the first time since my capture, I had actual conversations with other prisoners. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to my own. Normal lives shattered by psychic awakening, capture, months of imprisonment, and finally delivery to terror. We came from different worlds, different cultures, different backgrounds, but the Imperium had rendered all those differences meaningless. We were all the same now. We were all fuel. One of my chambermates was a woman named Kara, who had been a teacher on an agri-world before her awakening. She had taught children their letters, their numbers, the basic catechisms of the imperial cult. She had been good at it, she said, and had loved her work. Then one day she had touched a student's hand and suddenly known everything about the child, every thought, every fear, every memory. The shock had knocked her unconscious, and when she woke, enforcers were already at the school. That had been 8 months ago. Now she was here, waiting to die in service to the Emperor she had taught children to worship. Another was a young man named Davin who had worked on a mining world, operating heavy machinery in the planet's vast open pit excavations. His awakening had been more dramatic. He had gotten angry at a supervisor, and the man's head had simply exploded, liquefied by psychic energy Davin hadn't known he possessed. He had killed 3 more people before the Sisters of Silence arrived and suppressed his powers. He carried guilt for those deaths, guilt that no amount of ecclesiarchy preaching could assuage. Perhaps he saw his coming sacrifice as a form of penance, a way to balance the scales for the lives he had taken. We talked through the night, our last night as it turned out, though we didn't know it then. We talked about our lives before, about the people we had left behind, about what we imagined death would be like. Some believed they would wake in the Emperor's presence, their souls judged and found worthy to stand at his side. Others believed they would simply cease to exist, consciousness extinguished like a flame. Still others thought they might persist in some form, becoming part of the Astronomicon in a more literal sense, their awareness diffused across the psychic beacon, but not entirely destroyed. I didn't know what I believed. I wanted to believe in something, an afterlife, a reward, a continuation of consciousness in some form. But my rational mind rebelled against such hopes. I had felt the warp. I knew what happened to souls after death. They didn't go to some pleasant afterlife. They were absorbed into the warp, their psychic energy returning to that ocean of chaos, their individual identity dissolved into the collective emotional currents, unless, of course, the Emperor's presence could somehow shield us from that fate, could preserve something of ourselves even as he consumed our power. It was possible. He was, after all, the most powerful psyker in existence, a being of such vast capability that he could reshape reality itself. I spent my last night alternating between conversation with my chambermates and meditation. I tried to prepare myself mentally for what was coming, tried to build up my courage, tried to make peace with my impending death. I was not entirely successful. Fear kept creeping back in, no matter how many prayers I recited or how many times I reminded myself that this was service to the Emperor, that my death would have meaning and purpose. In the early hours of what would be my final day of anything resembling normal existence, a thought occurred to me. I would soon experience something that almost no living human had ever experienced and survived to describe. I would be brought into the Emperor's presence. I would feel his power directly, unfiltered by distance or intermediaries. For those few moments before my consciousness dissolved, I would be closer to the God Emperor of mankind than any but his most favoured servants ever came. That thought gave me courage. Not peace, exactly, but courage. I would die, yes, but I would die knowing something that almost no one else would ever know. I would die having touched, however briefly, the absolute pinnacle of human psychic potential. I would die in service to the being who was, in many very real senses, the only thing standing between humanity and the extinction that the forces of chaos constantly threatened. When the attendants came for us at what must have been dawn, though we were too deep underground to see the sun, I was as ready as I would ever be. They dressed us in new robes, white this time instead of grey, marked with symbols I didn't recognize but which radiated a sense of finality. They led us out of the preparation chambers and into corridors that descended even deeper into the palace structure. We were going to the Forbidden Fortress, the region of the Imperial Palace that housed the chamber of the Astronomicon, and beyond it, somewhere in the vast labyrinth of tunnels and chambers, was the Sanctum Imperialis itself, the chamber where the Emperor sat upon the golden throne, his body preserved in a state between life and death, his psychic might sustaining both himself and the beacon that made the Imperium possible. Understanding the golden throne, as we descended toward our final destination, one of the attendants, a woman who wore the robes of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, explained to us what we were about to experience. It was unusual for prisoners to be told such things, but perhaps she thought that understanding would make us more cooperative, or perhaps she simply felt we deserved to know what we were dying for. Whatever her motivation, I was grateful for the information. The Golden Throne, she explained, was an ancient device dating back to the Dark Age of technology, a time when humanity's technical knowledge far exceeded anything the Imperium currently possessed. The Emperor himself had discovered it in the ruins beneath Terra and had spent centuries restoring it for his own purposes. Originally, it had been part of his plan to provide humanity with access to the Elder Webway, an alternate dimension that would allow faster-than-light travel without the dangers of the warp. That plan had failed catastrophically during the Horus Heresy, when Magnus the Red's warning to the Emperor had breached the Webway's defences and allowed demons to pour through. The Emperor had been forced to sit upon the Golden Throne to seal the breach, using his psychic might to hold back the tide of chaos entities that threatened to consume Terra itself. He had remained there ever since, first voluntarily during the Siege of Terra, and then permanently after his battle with Horus left him mortally wounded. The Golden Throne now served two purposes. It kept the Emperor alive, sustaining his shattered body through technologies the Mechanicus could maintain but not fully understand, and it amplified his psychic power, allowing him to direct the Astronomicon across vast reaches of space. But the throne alone was not enough. Even the Emperor's vast power needed raw psychic energy to work with, needed fuel to transform into the directed, coherent signal that was the Astronomicon. That's where we came in. 10,000 psychers, she told us, were powering the Astronomicon at any given time, their psychic energy channeled through the chamber of the Astronomicon and then directed by the Emperor's will into the beacon that guided ships across the galaxy. The process was consuming. The constant flow of psychic energy, amplified by the ancient machinery of the chamber and shaped by the Emperor's consciousness, burned through psychers at an alarming rate. Some of the strongest could last for months, most lasted for weeks. The weakest barely survived a day, but all of them eventually died, their souls and psychic essence consumed in the creation of the Astronomicon. On average, about 100 psychers died every day and had to be replaced with fresh sacrifices. The numbers were staggering. 100 per day meant 36,500 per year. Multiply that by the 10,000 years since the Emperor was interred on the throne, and you got 365 million souls consumed in the service of the Astronomicon. 365 million people like me, all sacrificed to keep the Imperium functioning. But 365 million was a small price to pay, wasn't it? The Imperium contained 1 million worlds, each with populations ranging from millions to trillions. The total human population of the galaxy was estimated to be in the quadrillions, a number so large it ceased to have meaning. Set against that vast backdrop, 365 million deaths over 10,000 years was statistically insignificant. We were a rounding error in the demographic calculations of a galaxy-spanning empire, and yet each one of those 365 million had been a person. Each had lived a life, had dreams and fears and loves and hates. Each had been stripped of everything they knew and brought to Terra to die. The statistics might make our sacrifice seem trivial, but to each of us, our lives were everything. The Imperium was built on mountains of such trivial sacrifices, countless individuals giving up everything so that the whole could continue. The attendant also explained the Sanctum Imperialis to us. Though she warned that we probably wouldn't see it ourselves, the chamber of the Astronomicon was separate from the throne room, connected by conduits and machinery but physically distinct. The sanctum was described as the most holy place in the entire Imperium, a chamber vast enough to house thousands of space marines, its walls covered in gold and precious metals, its ceiling lost in shadows hundreds of meters overhead. At the center of this impossible space sat the golden throne itself, a massive device of technology and psychic architecture, and upon it sat the Emperor. She described him as he currently was, or at least as he was depicted in the holy images. His body was withered, skeletal, preserved by the throne's mechanisms but showing the terrible wounds inflicted by Horus 10,000 years ago. His flesh was golden, said to glow with inner light. His face was ageless yet ancient, both beautiful and terrible to behold, but his psychic presence was what truly defined him, a power so vast it could be felt across the galaxy, a consciousness so expansive it could direct the Astronomicon, while simultaneously appearing in visions to his faithful, while holding back the forces of chaos, while guiding the Imperium through 10,000 years of eternal war. The custodian guard attended him constantly, she told us. 10,000 guardians, each one a warrior of such skill and power that they made space marines look ordinary, stood eternal watch over the master of mankind. They had failed to protect him from Horus's treachery 10,000 years ago, and they would never forgive themselves for that failure. Now they stood vigil, ensuring that nothing and no one would ever threaten the Emperor again. As the attendant spoke, I felt the Emperor's presence growing stronger. We were getting very close now. The psychic pressure was becoming almost physical, like standing in a hurricane wind, like being pressed down by the weight of an ocean. Some of my fellow prisoners could barely walk, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the consciousness that lay ahead of us. Others seemed energized by it, standing straighter, walking with purpose and determination renewed by their proximity to the God Emperor. We passed through checkpoints guarded by custodians, those golden giants who regarded us with eyes that showed no warmth, no recognition, nothing but eternal vigilance. We passed tech priests who tended to machinery of such complexity and antiquity that they treated each lever and dial as a holy relic, performing maintenance through ritual and prayer as much as technical understanding. We passed servitors hardwired into control stations, their human minds long since eroded to nothing, reduced to biological components in larger systems they could no longer comprehend. And then we came to it, the Eternity Gate, the final threshold before the Sanctum Imperialis. It was a door the size of a titan, crafted from blessed adamantium and covered in reliefs depicting the Emperor's greatest victories, the unification of Terra, the Great Crusade, the defeat of the alien, the triumph of humanity. The door was closed, and the attendant explained it would remain closed. We weren't going through it. The Sanctum Imperialis lay beyond, forbidden to all but the custodians, the High Lords of Terra, and those few individuals granted specific permission to enter the Emperor's presence. We were turning left, she said, taking a corridor that led to the chamber of the Astronomicon. The path diverged here, one way to the Golden Throne itself, where the greatest heroes of the Imperium might be granted audience with the Emperor's preserved form, and another way to the chamber where we would spend our final days serving a function far more humble, but no less essential. The corridor to the chamber of the Astronomicon was different from the others we had traversed. The air itself seemed to shimmer, reality becoming thin here, the boundary between the material universe and the warp wearing away under the constant psychic pressure. I could see things at the edges of my vision, shapes that shouldn't exist, colours that had no names, suggestions of spaces that extended in directions that geometry didn't allow. This was a place where the warp and reality overlapped, where the psychic realm pressed so close to the physical that the distinction between them became blurred and uncertain. The protective wards were everywhere here, carved into every surface, blazing with psychic energy that fought constantly to maintain their boundaries between dimensions. Without those wards, I realized, this entire section of the palace would collapse into the warp, consumed by the very forces it was designed to harness. The Imperium was playing with powers that could destroy terror itself, dancing on a razor's edge between functionality and catastrophe, and I was about to become part of that dance. Final days before sacrifice, they led us into an antechamber just outside the actual chamber of the Astronomicon. It was here that we would wait until our moment came, here that we would prepare ourselves for the final transition from individuals into components of something vastly larger. The antechamber was surprisingly serene, or perhaps that was just the drugs they had been administering, substances designed to keep us calm and compliant in the face of our impending dissolution. There were perhaps 100 of us in the antechamber, all freshly arrived from various processing facilities across the Imperial Palace complex. We were allowed to sit or lie on simple pallets arranged around the room's perimeter. Water and food were provided, though I found I had little appetite. My body knew, even if my conscious mind tried to deny it, that there was no point in eating anymore. I was at the end of all things. I spent my last hours in meditation and observation. Around me, my fellow sacrifices dealt with the reality of our situation in different ways. Some prayed constantly, reciting every litany and catechism they had ever learned, seeking comfort in the familiar words. Others sat in what appeared to be catatonic states, minds already retreating from the horror of what was about to happen. A few talked among themselves in quiet voices, sharing memories of their lives before, trying to preserve some fragment of their identities before those identities dissolved into the psychic furnace of the Astronomicon. Periodically, attendants would come and select groups of psychers from the antechamber, leading them through the massive doors into the chamber itself. Those who entered did not return. Through the briefly opened doors, I caught glimpses of what lay beyond a space so vast it seemed to defy physical laws, filled with light that was not light, with sounds that were not sounds, with sensations that human nervous systems were never designed to process. And I felt them, the 10,000 psychers already in the chamber, their minds joined in a terrible harmony, their psychic essences flowing together to create the raw energy that the Emperor would shape into the Astronomicon. They were still individuals in some sense, but that individuality was fading, subsumed into the collective consciousness that sustained the beacon. I could feel their pain, their fear, their resignation. But I could also feel their pride, their certainty that they were serving a purpose greater than any one life could contain. Some of them had been there for months. Their minds were worn thin, personalities eroded by the constant psychic strain, reduced to little more than conduits for the energy that flowed through them. They were dying slowly, minute by minute, as the Astronomicon consumed them. Others had been there for days or weeks, still relatively fresh, still maintaining some sense of self even as they contributed to the collective effort. And the newest arrivals were just beginning to understand what they had become, just starting the process of dissolution that would eventually claim them all. 100 would die today. 100 would be replaced. The eternal cycle continued, had continued for 10,000 years, would continue for as long as the Imperium needed the Astronomicon, which was to say, forever. An attendant approached me, a middle-aged woman with the tired eyes of someone who had been performing the same duty for decades. She knelt beside my pallet and spoke in a gentle voice, It will be your time soon. The chamber is nearly ready for the next rotation. Is there anything you wish to say? Any message you would like recorded for those you left behind? I considered the question. Was there anyone I wanted to send a message to? My parents were long dead, killed in a Hablok collapse when I was young. I had no siblings, no close friends beyond work acquaintances who had already forgotten me the moment I was arrested. My entire life had been small, insignificant, forgotten almost before it ended. No, I said finally, and there's no one. She nodded, unsurprised. Most of us, I imagined, had no one worth sending final words to. We were the rejected, the cursed, the mutations that society cast out. Our only value now was as fuel for the God Emperor's beacon. Then I will offer you what comfort I can, she said, and placed her hand on my forehead. Know that your sacrifice matters. Know that every ship that crosses the galaxy, every Imperial world that receives supplies and reinforcements, every victory won in the Emperor's name, all of it is possible because of people like you. You will die, but your death will mean something. The Imperium will continue. Humanity will endure, and that endurance is built on foundations of souls like yours, willingly given in service to something greater than any individual life. Her words should have brought comfort, and perhaps they did, in some small way. But they also highlighted the fundamental truth of existence in the Imperium. Individuals did not matter. Only the collective survival of humanity mattered. My life had no intrinsic value beyond what service I could provide. I was not precious. I was not unique. I was simply a unit of psychic potential, a resource to be expended in the endless war against extinction. And yet, I found myself accepting that truth. What was one life weighed against quadrillions? What was one death set against the survival of the species? The Emperor understood this mathematics of sacrifice. He had built an empire on it, sustained it for 10 millennia, through the calculated expenditure of human lives measured in billions and trillions. My death was not a tragedy, it was a statistic, a necessary cost of maintaining the greatest human civilization ever to exist. I thought of all the humans across the galaxy who would live because of my sacrifice. The families on distant worlds who would never know my name but who would survive because the ships bringing food and medicine could navigate the warp using the Astronomican's light. The soldiers fighting on the frontiers of the Imperium who would receive reinforcements because those reinforcements could be transported accurately across the stars. The children who would be born and grow and live entire lives in the relative safety of the Imperium's protection, made possible, in part, by the psychic beacon I was about to help create. My death would touch all of them. Not directly, not in any way they would ever understand or appreciate, but in the vast web of causality that connected all human endeavours. My dissolution into the Astronomican would ripple out across the galaxy, enabling the continued function of the Imperium and all the lives and loves and hopes that depended on it. It was a strangely comforting thought. I would die, but I would not die meaninglessly. Every moment of my brief existence had been leading to this final act of service that would justify every breath I had ever taken, every thought I had ever had, every experience that had shaped the person I had become. The attendant squeezed my hand gently, then moved on to offer similar comfort to the next person on the next pallet. I sat in silence, feeling the Emperor's presence growing stronger with each passing moment, sensing the chamber beyond the doors, aware that my time was approaching. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had become fluid in this place where reality and warp overlapped. where normal physical laws bent under the weight of psychic forces. I existed in a state between meditation and awareness, conscious of my surroundings but not fully engaged with them, my mind already beginning the process of letting go. And then they came for me, a different attendant, this one a young man who moved with the precise efficiency of someone who had performed this duty thousands of times. He touched my shoulder and I stood, joining a group of about 30 other psychers who had been selected for this rotation. We were led toward the massive doors that were opening now, revealing the chamber of the Astronomicon in all its terrible glory. My last thought as an individual, the last thought that was entirely my own, was a simple one. The Emperor protects. And then I crossed the threshold into a space that should not exist, into a purpose that would consume me, into a sacrifice that would echo across the stars for as long as the Imperium endured. The chamber of the Astronomicon. The chamber was beyond description, not because it was too beautiful or too terrible, but because it existed in a state that human senses were not designed to process. It was a physical space. I could see walls and ceiling and floor, could feel the ground beneath my feet. But it was also more than physical. It extended into the warp, occupying space in multiple dimensions simultaneously, a place where the materium and the immaterium were woven together into something entirely unique. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, breathing in rhythm with some vast heartbeat I could feel but not hear. They were covered in machinery, ancient holy machinery that dated back to the dark age of technology, devices whose purpose was known only to the highest echelons of the Mechanicus, and perhaps not even to them. Cables thick as a man's torso ran across the surfaces, carrying psychic energy as much as electrical current, pulsing with light that shifted through spectrums visible and invisible. At the centre of the chamber, impossible to ignore, was the choir. 10,000 psychers arranged in concentric circles, their bodies restrained in apparatus that held them upright, while simultaneously monitoring their vital signs and amplifying their psychic output. They were all conscious. That was the horror of it. They had to be conscious. The Astronomicon required not just psychic power but directed will, minds focused on a single purpose even as those minds were slowly consumed in the process. I could hear them, though not with my ears. Their thoughts formed a chorus, a psychic harmony of terrible beauty. They were singing, in a sense not with voices but with their very souls, each one contributing a note to a chord that resonated across the galaxy. And conducting this impossible chorus, shaping their raw psychic energy into the focused beam of the Astronomicon, was the Emperor himself. I couldn't see him. He was elsewhere, in the Sanctum Imperialis, seated upon the golden throne, but his presence was absolute. His will touched every psyker in the chamber, directing them, using them, transforming their sacrifice into the beacon that guided humanity. The new arrivals, my group of 30, were led to empty positions within the outer ring of the choir. The apparatus awaited us, frameworks of metal and crystal that would hold our bodies and amplify our minds, conduits that would connect us to the collective consciousness, devices that would measure how much longer we could endure before we finally burned out entirely. I was positioned between two psychers who had clearly been there for some time. To my left was a man whose face had gone grey, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets, his body thin to the point of emaciation despite the nutrient lines that fed directly into his bloodstream. He was still alive, still contributing to the choir, but barely. Days, perhaps hours, remained to him. To my right was a woman who looked fresher, more recently arrived, though her expression showed the strain of what she was experiencing. Her lips moved constantly, forming words I couldn't hear, prayers or screams or simply the babbling of a mind under extreme duress. The attendants secured me into the apparatus with practiced efficiency. Restraints held my arms, legs, torso and head in position. They inserted needles into my veins, establishing the nutrient feeds that would keep my body functioning even as my mind was consumed. They placed a crown of metal and crystal on my head, and immediately I felt it connect to something deep within my brain, establishing pathways between my nervous system and the vast machinery of the chamber. Then came the moment of connection. The apparatus activated, and suddenly I was no longer alone in my own head. I felt the presence of every other psyker in the chamber, 10,000 minds pressing against mine, not invading but overlapping, our consciousness becoming plural, even as we maintained some fragment of individual identity. It was overwhelming, too much sensation, too much emotion, too many thoughts happening simultaneously. I wanted to scream but couldn't, wanted to flee but was held in place by restraints both physical and psychic, and through it all, I felt him, the Emperor. His consciousness was like a sun that the rest of us orbited, massive beyond comprehension, hot beyond endurance, brilliant beyond the capacity of minds to process. He was aware of me not as an individual perhaps, but as a component, a part of the greater whole. I felt his will touch mine, shaping me, directing me, commanding me to open myself to the warp and channel its energies into the collective purpose of the choir. I had no choice but to obey. The command was absolute, irresistible, woven into the very fabric of my being. I opened myself to the warp and immediately felt the torrent of energy that poured through that opening. It was like trying to drink from a waterfall, like trying to breathe in a hurricane. The psychic energy of the warp was infinite and chaotic, raw, emotional power given form, the literal substance of conscious thought across the entire galaxy. My role, I understood now, was to channel that energy, not to control it. I lacked the strength for that, simply to allow it to flow through me, to add my small stream to the great river that the 10,000 of us created together. The Emperor would do the actual shaping, would take the raw psychic torrent and transform it into the Astronomican's coherent beam. We were simply the conduits, the pipes through which the energy flowed on its way to being directed by the master of mankind. It hurt. Not physical pain, though there was some of that. The apparatus was not designed for comfort, and my body quickly began to ache from the enforced immobility. But the real pain was psychic, the agony of channeling energies that eroded the very substance of my soul. I could feel myself beginning to fade, my identity starting to dissolve like sugar in water, personality and memory slowly being consumed by the relentless flow of warp energy through my being. Time became even more meaningless than it had been in the antechamber. I might have been in the chamber for hours or days or weeks, I had no way to tell. My perception was entirely consumed by the experience of the choir, by the overwhelming presence of the Emperor, by the constant burning flow of psychic energy. I was dimly aware of my body's deterioration, of nutrients being pumped in to keep me alive, of waste being extracted, of my physical form being maintained as a container for my psychic essence, even as that essence was being steadily drained away. Around me, psychers died. I felt each death as it happened, a sudden absence in the choir, a voice falling silent, a gap appearing in the harmony that was immediately filled by a replacement from the antechamber. The rotation was constant. As psychers burned out, fresh sacrifices took their places, maintaining the choir at its required strength of 10,000. The deaths were not tragic. They were simply expected, calculated, part of the system that kept the Astronomicon functioning. I felt my neighbour to the left die on what might have been my third day in the chamber. One moment his presence was there, a fading spark of consciousness contributing what little it still could to the collective effort. The next moment, nothing. His body slumped in its restraints. Whatever had animated it finally exhausted beyond recovery. Attendants came and removed him, disconnecting the apparatus with the same practiced efficiency with which they had connected me. A new psyker was brought in to replace him, and the choir continued without missing a beat. I knew I would end the same way. We all knew. But the knowledge brought no fear anymore. I was too far gone for that, too dissolved into the collective consciousness to maintain individual emotions like fear or despair. I existed in a state beyond such things, aware but not concerned, present but not attached, contributing to something so vast that my own extinction was simply irrelevant. And through it all, I felt the Astronomicon itself, not just as an abstract concept but as a reality, a massive psychic beacon that blazed out from Terra across 50,000 light-years of space. I was part of that beacon now, my consciousness woven into its substance, my soul contributing to the light that guided ships through the warp. Somewhere out in the galaxy, a navigator was seeing that light, was using it to plot a course through the chaotic tides of the Imperium, was steering their ship safely to its destination because the choir existed, because 10,000 psychers were sacrificing themselves to create the beacon. My death was happening slowly, minute by minute, as the psychic energy flowing through me eroded the substance of my being. But that death was enabling life across the Imperium trade, communication, warfare, exploration, all the activities that made humanity's galaxy-spanning empire possible. I was a small part of an immense machine, a single cog in a mechanism so vast and complex that no individual could comprehend its full scope. But I could feel my place in that machine, could understand my function, could take pride in the role I played even as that role consumed me. The Emperor's presence was constant, unavoidable, absolute. He was not gentle, there was no gentleness in his use of us, no mercy in the way he shaped our psychic essences to his purpose. But there was no malice either. He was simply efficient, pragmatic, focused entirely on the maintenance of the Astronomicon. We were tools to him, instruments to be used until they broke and then replaced with new instruments. It was not cruel. It was not kind. It simply was, the way gravity simply is, the way physical laws simply are a fundamental truth of existence in the Imperium of Man. The Emperor's presence, as days turned into weeks, or what passed for weeks in that place beyond time, I found myself experiencing something unexpected. The erosion of my individual identity, which I had feared would be the worst part of this ordeal, was actually bringing a strange kind of peace. The boundaries between myself and the other psychers in the choir were becoming increasingly porous. I could feel their thoughts as easily as my own, could share their memories, their experiences, their understanding of the universe. We were becoming a collective consciousness, a group mind bound together by our shared purpose and our connection to the Emperor's will. And the more I dissolved into that collective, the more I could sense the Emperor himself. Not just his commands, not just his will directing the Astronomicon, but something deeper glimpses of his vast consciousness, fragments of his thoughts that leaked through the connection we shared with him. I understood, in those moments of profound connection, why humanity worshipped him as a god. His mind was so far beyond human capacity that comprehending even the smallest fraction of it was like an insect trying to understand quantum physics. He thought in dimensions that shouldn't exist, processed information faster than light could travel, maintained awareness of events across the entire galaxy simultaneously. The Astronomicon was only one of countless tasks he managed every moment. He was also holding back the demonic incursion through the breached webway, appearing in visions to his faithful across 1,000,000 worlds, guiding the decisions of the High Lords of Terror, maintaining the psychic wards that protected the Sanctum Imperialis, and performing functions I couldn't even begin to understand. And he had been doing this for 10,000 years. 10,000 years of sitting motionless upon the golden throne, his body withered and broken, sustained only by ancient technology and the daily sacrifice of psychers like me. 10,000 years of constant, unrelenting vigilance, holding back the forces of chaos with nothing but his indomitable will and incomprehensible power. The magnitude of that sacrifice made my own seem trivial by comparison. I caught glimpses of his memories sometimes, fragments that leaked through our connection when his attention shifted between tasks. I saw the Unification Wars, when he had united the scattered nations of Terra under his rule through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and, when necessary, overwhelming military force. I saw the creation of the Primarchs, his gene sons, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering and psychic manipulation, designed to lead humanity's conquest of the stars. I saw the Great Crusade, that glorious epoch when humanity had reached out across the galaxy, reclaiming worlds that had been isolated for thousands of years, bringing them back into the fold of a unified civilization. And I saw the heresy, the betrayal of Horus, his most beloved son, corrupted by the Chaos Gods and turned against everything the Emperor had built. The galaxy-spanning civil war that had nearly destroyed humanity. The desperate siege of Terra itself, when traitor legions had beaten at the gates of the Imperial Palace. The final confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit, when the Emperor had been forced to kill Horus, destroying not just his son's body but his very soul, erasing him from existence with psychic power that burned reality itself. That final battle had cost the Emperor everything. The wounds Horus had inflicted were beyond any power to heal. Interred upon the Golden Throne, the Emperor had been forced to sacrifice his mobility, his freedom, his ability to walk among humanity and guide them directly. He had become a prisoner of his own device, bound to the throne for eternity or until Terra itself fell. But he endured. Through 10 millennia of endless suffering, through the slow decay of his physical form, through the constant pain of his unhealing wounds, he endured. Because he had to. Because without him, the Astronomicon would fail and humanity would be cut off from itself, unable to navigate the warp, unable to maintain their empire. Because without him holding back the demonic incursion through the breached webway, Terra itself would fall to chaos. Because he was the foundation upon which the entire Imperium rested, and if that foundation crumbled, so too would humanity's last great civilization. My sacrifice, I realized, was part of his sacrifice. Every psyker consumed by the Astronomicon was extending his existence by another day, enabling him to continue his eternal vigil. We were buying time, trading our brief lives for moments of his immortal endurance. It was the most unequal exchange imaginable, thousands of human lifespans for days of his existence, but it was necessary. Without us, he would fail. Without him, humanity would fall. The mathematics were simple and terrible. As I contemplated these truths, I felt myself fading further. My memories were becoming harder to access, as if they belonged to someone else, someone I had known long ago but could no longer quite recall. My personality, the quirks and preferences and habits that had defined me as an individual, was eroding, smoothed away like a stone worn down by constant water. I was becoming generic, universal, just another component of the choir without distinguishing features. But curiously, I didn't mourn the loss. The ego that would have cared about preserving itself was dissolving along with everything else. I was transcending individuality, becoming part of something greater than any single consciousness could contain. My awareness was expanding even as my identity contracted, encompassing more and more of the choir, touching minds across the vast circle of 10,000 psychers, experiencing their experiences, knowing their thoughts. I felt a young woman from a frozen hive world, her life one of constant hunger and cold until her powers manifested and the black ships took her. I felt an old man from an agri-world who had lived 70 years before his latent psychic abilities finally emerged. I felt children barely old enough to understand what was happening to them, ripped from their families and brought to terror to die. I felt nobles who had hidden their powers for years, warriors who had used their abilities in secret to survive battlefields, scholars who had researched psychic phenomena and accidentally awakened their own potential. We were all different. We came from 1,000,000 different backgrounds, 1,000 different circumstances. But in the choir, those differences ceased to matter. We were all the same now, conduits for the Emperor's power, fuel for the Astronomicon, sacrifices on the altar of humanity's survival. And we were all dying. The rate varied. Some of us would last weeks or even months, while others would burn out in days. But the destination was the same for every one of us. Our consciousness would erode until nothing remained. Our bodies would fail despite the best efforts of the apparatus sustaining us, and we would simply cease to exist. Our psychic essence consumed entirely in the process of powering the beacon. I thought I had weeks remaining. My strength was greater than average, my will more resilient, my psychic potential more robust. But I could feel the strain taking its toll, could sense my life force being steadily depleted. Every hour in the choir aged me in ways that couldn't be measured by simple time. My soul was being burned like fuel, and eventually, inevitably, there would be nothing left to burn. The final dissolution. It was perhaps 2 weeks after my integration into the choir, though time had become so fluid that I couldn't be certain when I felt the beginning of the end. The psychic energy flowing through me had finally eroded away too much of my essential substance. I could feel my consciousness starting to fragment, my awareness beginning to split into disconnected pieces that couldn't quite cohere into a unified whole. The physical sensations came first. The apparatus feeding nutrients into my body began struggling to keep up with the deterioration. My heart, pushed beyond its normal capacity for so long, was beginning to fail. My brain, worn thin by the constant channeling of warp energy, was losing its ability to maintain basic biological functions. I was shutting down, system by system, as the toll of my service finally exceeded my body's ability to endure. But I felt no pain. The drugs and the apparatus and my own transcendence of individual consciousness had moved me beyond such things. I experienced my dying as a distant, almost academic process, interesting perhaps, but not particularly concerning. Fear would have required an ego that still cared about survival, and I had moved beyond such attachments. The collective consciousness of the choir acknowledged my impending departure with something that might have been sympathy, or might simply have been noting a fact. One more voice falling silent, one more gap to be filled, one more psyche consumed in service to the Astronomicon. It happened 100 times a day, had happened millions of times over 10,000 years, would continue happening for as long as the Imperium endured. My death was not special. It was not even particularly notable. It simply was. I felt the replacement being prepared in the antechamber, a young person whose face I could see through our psychic connection. They were terrified, as I had been terrified, uncertain of what awaited them. But they would serve, as I had served. They would contribute their strength to the choir, however briefly. They would become part of something greater than themselves, and eventually they too would fade, consumed by the relentless demands of the Astronomicon. As my consciousness fragmented further, I found myself experiencing time non-linearly. Past and present and possible futures all seemed to exist simultaneously, overlapping and interweaving in patterns I could almost but not quite comprehend. I saw my childhood on the hive world, my life in the manufactorums, my awakening as a psyker, but I also saw versions of myself that had never existed, lives I might have lived if I had not been cursed with psychic ability, futures that had been denied the moment my powers manifested. I saw myself growing old on my homeworld, never knowing about the psyker gene sleeping in my DNA. I saw myself dying in a manufacturum accident at age 35, crushed by falling machinery, my brief life ending without ever serving the Emperor directly. I saw myself being destroyed by demons during my awakening, my body used as a doorway for entities from the warp, causing untold death and suffering before being put down by an inquisitor. Compared to those alternatives, my actual fate seemed almost merciful. At least I was dying in service to something greater than myself. At least my death had meaning and purpose. At least I was contributing, however minutely, to the survival of humanity across the stars. The Emperor's presence grew stronger as I weakened, as if he was drawing me closer as I approached the moment of final dissolution. I felt his attention focus on me for just an instant, not as an individual, but as a component that was about to fail and need replacement. There was no warmth in that attention, no recognition of my sacrifice or my service, but there was something else, a vast, impersonal acknowledgement that what I had done mattered, that my brief service had contributed to his eternal purpose, that my small light had helped sustain the beacon that guided humanity. It was enough, more than enough. My last coherent thought was not about myself, not about what I was losing or what might come after. It was about the ship I had sensed earlier through the Astronomicon's beam, the navigator using our collective light to guide their vessel safely through the warp. Because of us, because of me and the other 9,999 psychers in the choir, that ship would reach its destination. The people aboard would live. The cargo they carried would be delivered. The small purposes of their individual lives would be fulfilled and multiplied across thousands of ships, millions of journeys, billions of lives. Our sacrifice enabled the vast, complex web of human civilization to continue functioning. We were invisible, forgotten, never acknowledged or honored. but we were essential. Without us, everything would stop, and so we gave ourselves willingly, trading our brief existences for the continued survival of the species. My consciousness fragmented completely. The boundaries of self dissolved entirely. I became part of the choir in the most absolute sense. My identity dispersed across 10,000 minds. My awareness diffused into the collective whole. Individual sensation ceased. The pain stopped. The fear ended. Even the pride in my service faded away. There was a moment. I don't know how long it lasted. Could have been seconds or hours or days when I existed in a state beyond description. I was the Astronomicon itself, or perhaps just a tiny fragment of it. I was light blazing across the galaxy, illuminating the warp for navigators, guiding ships safely through the madness of the Imperium. I touched minds across unimaginable distances, brushed against the consciousness of humans on worlds whose names I would never know, felt my light reflected in their thoughts and purposes, and then even that faded. The last traces of what I had been dissolved completely, consumed by the Astronomicon, transformed into pure psychic energy that the Emperor shaped into the beacon. I ceased to be a person. I ceased to be anything recognizable as an individual consciousness. I became light and purpose and service rendered, and then I was gone. The epilogue, the eternal vigil. The position in the choir that I had occupied for 2 weeks was immediately filled by the replacement from the antechamber. They settled into the apparatus, felt the crown placed upon their head, experienced the moment of connection with the 10,000 other psychers. They screamed silently, as we all had screamed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had become part of, and the choir sang on. The Astronomicon blazed on. The Emperor's presence continued to conduct our symphony of sacrifice, shaping our collective psychic output into the beacon that made the Imperium possible. 100 psychers died that day, as they died every day. 100 were replaced. The eternal rotation continued, had continued for 10,000 years, would continue for 10,000 more if the Imperium endured that long. Across the galaxy, ships navigated safely through the warp, their navigators fixing upon the Astronomicon's light. Colonies received supplies that kept them alive. Military reinforcements arrived where they were needed. Trade flowed between worlds separated by impossible distances. Communication was maintained across the vastness of space, and none of those who benefited from the Astronomicon knew the names of the psychers who died to power it. None could comprehend the scale of the sacrifice, the sheer number of souls consumed in its maintenance. To them, the beacon was simply there, a fact of existence, as reliable as gravity or the passage of time. But it wasn't reliable. It required constant feeding, constant sacrifice, constant replenishment. Every day, the black ships arrived at Terra with fresh cargo. Every day, psychers were processed, categorized, prepared for service. Every day, the choir consumed them and demanded more. And in the Sanctum Imperialis, seated upon the golden throne, the Emperor of mankind endured. His consciousness stretched across impossible distances, maintaining the beacon, holding back the demonic incursion, appearing in visions to the faithful, guiding the Imperium through its endless crises. He had endured for 10,000 years. He would endure for 10,000 more. He had to. Humanity had no other choice. The Imperium stood on foundations of sacrifice. Every world paid tithes measured in lives and resources. Every generation gave up millions of its children to the Imperial Guard, sending them to fight and die on distant battlefields. Every institution demanded service that consumed those who gave it. And at the very heart of it all, beneath the Imperial Palace, in the chamber of the Astronomicon, the most profound sacrifice of all continued every moment of every day. 10,000 psychers, their lives measured in weeks or months, burning themselves to nothing so that the Imperium could endure. It was brutal. It was necessary. It was the price of survival in a galaxy that offered no mercy to the weak or hesitant. My name, if anyone had bothered to record it, would be listed in a ledger somewhere deep in the archives of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. One name among millions, a single line of data in an endless list of sacrifices. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that I had served. I had contributed my small light to the great beacon. I had played my part in the vast machine that kept humanity together across the stars. And that service, that sacrifice, that willing surrender of everything I was and could ever be, that was what it meant to be sacrificed to the Emperor in Warhammer 40,000. The Imperium will endure, humanity will survive, and the Astronomicon will continue to burn, fueled by souls like mine, lighting the way through darkness, guiding the faithful home. The Emperor protects, and we, the forgotten, the consumed, the sacrificed, we are how he protects. If you found this exploration of the grimdark reality of the Warhammer 40K universe interesting, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. The Imperium's lore is vast and dark, and there are countless other stories to explore, from the horrors of chaos corruption to the eternal duty of the Space Marines, from the nightmares of the warp to the desperate struggles of humanity across a million worlds. What aspect of the Warhammer 40k universe would you like to hear about next? Drop a comment below and let me know. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also service, sacrifice, and the slim hope that humanity might endure for one more day.